take a look at this raw file. This was shot during sunrise, but you can clearly see we are missing sunrise colors in the sky. So I'm going to show you a way with which we can reintroduce those nice, vibrant warm tones using Lightroom. As always, feel free to follow along by downloading the raw file from the link in the description of the video. And now let's begin. The first thing, as always, we're going to start with the basic adjustments. So let's expand the basic panel, and right away what I want to do is to change the profile to Adobe Standard, which will lessen the overall contrast, and I'm doing that because I want to have more control over the contrast myself. Right away what you can see is the sky is a little bit blown out, and I also want to make the whole shot feel a little bit darker. So what I'm going to do is to bring down the exposure very gently to make everything darker. And doing this, we now have much more details in the sky. Plus, the whole landscape in the foreground does have a much more grim look. So that's exactly what I want. But I don't want to make it too dark. You can see there are some areas in the very darkest parts that are now almost clipping, and that's not what we want to have. So I'm going to bring up the shadows just a little bit, and I'm also going to bring up the blacks. Again, this will also kind of lessen the overall contrast, but this will really help saving those super dark areas of this scene. Now, taking a look at the histogram, you can see we do have a little bit of room to play around with in those brighter areas, and we can make use of that to add back some contrast. To target this area, I'm going to use the white slider, and I'm going to bring it up just a little bit. Doing this, we will reintroduce a bit of contrast, and we are going to make this whole shot a little bit brighter as well, so that's great. And that's pretty much it for the basic tonal adjustments. But we didn't really change the colors. We can do that in the next step with the white balance. As I said in the intro, we want to reintroduce some of these sunset colors. Right now you can see this whole image has a very strong blue color cast. And using the white balance, you could fix that quite easily, bringing up the temperature. And just like that, we have a lot warmer sky. But the problem is the landscape in the foreground has lost its unique look. So we need to find a balance. I'm going to tone down the temperature a little bit. I would say let's go with around 7,000. At this point we still have the blue tones in the landscape, but we're starting to get back some of these warmer tones in the sky. So that is a great balance. Of course, we need to target those areas separately at a later point of the editing process to further enhance those colors. But for now, that's a really good starting point. We can also bring up the vibrance so we can see a little better what's going on. I'm going to push the vibrance quite a bit because I want this shot to be super colorful. So let's go with something like that. Alright, nice. I also want this image to look sharp and clean. Therefore, let's bring up the texture and let's also raise the clarity. Beautiful. And that's it for the basic adjustments. Now let's compare to before real quick. You can see our shot got a lot darker, but that's intended because I want to have this darker feeling. At the same time, the sky looks much better with the warmer tones applied. So now we can focus on areas locally and fine-tune everything. And as always, we're going to use masks. Open up the masking panel and right away, let's work on the sky. Now, I don't want to use Lightroom's sky selection because this mask usually isn't that precise. Instead, I'm going to use a landscape mask. In here, again, we are not choosing the sky selection because you can see it's overlapping the mountains quite heavily. That's a big issue. What we're going to do is to click on mountains, which will give us a much better edge. And I'm also going to choose architecture to have this part selected as well. Then I want to click on create masks, and then we want to invert that. So let's right click, invert mask 1. That's looking much better. Of course, we still need to clean it up. So I'm going to subtract a linear gradient. Let's take out everything from the bottom. And I'm going to subtract a brush to clean up those finer things right here, which I cannot clean up with the linear gradient. Okay, and just like that, we have a perfect sky selection. Now we can use this mask to reintroduce sunrise colors. And we do have a bunch of different options. The first and the most obvious one is the temperature slider, which I just used previously as well. So I'm going to bring up the temperature, but I'm not going to go too crazy like this because one, this does look unnatural, And I'm going to be stacking multiple different masks on top of the sky to get much preciser color control. So we're going to tone down the temperature. We want to just introduce a little bit like that. What we can do, instead of just pushing the temperature, we can also bring up the saturation to make the colors in the sky more intense. So let's bring it up like this. The sky is still overwhelmingly blue, but again, we do have a bunch of different options here. So the next step is to click on this thing right here, with which you can add a specific color to an area. So I want to make the sky warm. I'm going to choose a warm hue like this. And then we can play around with the saturation slider. I can bring it up to make the colors more intense, or I can tone it down to keep it more subtle. As I said, I will be stacking multiple masks on top of each other, so I'm going to keep it subtle at first. Let's go with something like this. Okay. Then there's one more way with which we can introduce a little more warmth to the sky, and that's the tone curve. For that, let's click on the curve panel right here, and I want to head into the red tone curve. I'm going to pick the point for the highlights, and I'm going to drag it slightly to the left. You can see this will introduce some red tones to the sky. Of course, this is way too much, so we want to tone it down a bit. Let's go with something like this. That's much better. Now you might think these were some rather subtle changes, but let me deactivate the masks so you can see the difference from before to after. And those sunrise colors already got way more intense, but of course we can continue. I'm going to duplicate this mask because I once more want to work on the sky. So right click, actually let me duplicate and invert because this will reset all the settings we have applied to this mask. And then once more I'm going to right click on the mask and click invert. So we are back to our sky selection without any settings applied. How can we further fine-tune the sky? Basically, I want the brighter part of the sky to feel warmer and the darker part of the sky to feel colder. Using this mask, I'm going to start working on the bottom or the brighter part. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient and I'm taking out pretty much everything except a very tiny part right here. And in here, I'm going to first bring up the exposure, making that part of the sky brighter. Let's go for something like this. And I'm going to bring up the temperature. And this time I'm going to bring up the temperature a lot since I'm only affecting a very tiny area. And this tiny area I really want to make glow in a bright yellow tone like this. You might want to play around with the linear gradient to figure out a good position right here, but I think that's looking pretty decent. And now I'm going to repeat these steps. So I'm again going back to our base sky mask. I'm going to duplicate this mask and let's say duplicate and invert to get rid of the settings. Then once more invert this mask and I'm going to subtract a linear gradient. This time I'm taking out a little bit less, but I still want to target the bottom bright part of the sky like this. And again, I want to introduce some warmth and some brightness. So let's start with some exposure once more, just a little bit. We don't want to introduce any clipping. Then let's bring up the temperature. Beautiful. Now you can see how this comes together. The bottom part becoming more vibrant and warmer while the top part stays relatively dark and cold. That's exactly what we want. I'm also going to push the saturation and I'm pushing it all the way up because I want to have these intense colors right there in the bottom area of the sky. And finally, I'm going to make use of that color box once more because I want to add a specific orange tone. So let's set up the hue like this. And let's bring up the saturation. Look how the sky is changing this way. That's looking so much better already. Alright, let me turn off all these masks once more to see the difference from before to after. Since we are specifically targeting the sky, we now have introduced a very nice looking color contrast between the warmth of the sky and the cold tones of the landscape in the foreground. Now let's also work on the very top of the sky. For this I'm going to use a new linear gradient and let me just target the sky like this. Of course we are affecting the landscape at this point, but don't worry, I'm going to subtract a landscape mask and here just choose the mountains and click on create mask. And there we have a perfect selection for the sky again. As I said, I want the top of the sky to be a little darker, so all I need to do is to bring down the exposure. Like this. Alright, I might want to change the linear gradient a bit. I don't want to make the top of the sky too dark. Alright, I think I'm pretty happy with the sky for now. Then, of course, I also want to work on the landscape. Again, let's make use of the first mask we have created. Right click, duplicate and invert. This time we can use this selection as it is. And I'm going to just bring up the whites a bit, which will help make the snow a bit brighter. Okay, that's looking nice. This just gives us some more contrast. Let me use a new landscape mask. This time I'm choosing the architecture selection right here and let's click on create mask. Of course, I only want to change the subject, not that thing in the bottom right corner. I'm going to subtract with a brush and let's just get rid of it. I want the subject to be a little bit brighter, so I'm going to bring up the exposure. I'm also going to bring up the whites. And I'm also going to bring up the temperature because I have a feeling it's a little bit too cold still. So I want to change that. I'm also going to drop the saturation just a little bit to balance the colors a little better here. But that's about it. Okay, now I want to add a little bit of a 3D effect in the foreground. I'm going to create a new select objects mask. I'm using the rectangle select mode, which will give me better results. And I'm trying to select that hill in the foreground. Then I'm going to subtract a linear gradient, taking out the bottom right corner. With the remaining mask, I'm going to bring up the exposure. And you can see this will create a really nice light effect. And thus it will create a little more depth. We can further work on this effect by creating a linear gradient. And let's create one like this. I'm using this to create some kind of shadow. All I need to do for that is to bring down the exposure. And that's it. I do think I also want to work on the mountains real quick. Let's create a new landscape mask and let's choose the mountains. That's a perfect selection. Let's click on create mask. I do want to make them look sharper. So let's bring up the texture. At the same time, I kind of want to reduce the contrast in here. I'm going to drop the clarity, which will mainly affect the midtones contrast. So something like this. And I'm going to drop the overall contrast as well. I'm doing this to kind of soften these mountains in the background, but I also want to keep them darker. As I bring down the contrast, they will get a bit brighter, so I'm balancing this by bringing down the exposure just a notch like this. Beautiful. And I think we are done with the masking adjustment. So let me turn off all these masks to see the difference from before to after. And now you can really see those sunrise colors. But of course we can fine tune them now with a little bit of color grading. Let's go ahead, open up the color mixer. I'm starting in the hue tab. One thing I'm doing here is to bring down the yellow hue, which will shift the yellow tones in the sky more towards an orange color tone. So that's looking much better already. Let's take a look in the saturation tab. I'm going to bring up the yellow saturation. And I'm also going to bring up the orange saturation to specifically boost those sunrise colors. Okay, now let's go into the color grading tab. Let's start with the highlights. Of course, we want the highlights to be warm, so we're going to set up a warm hue. And then we need to play around with the saturation slider. Here it's totally up to you. You can push it all away if you want, which will give you some really intense sunrise colors. I don't want to go too crazy here, so I'm going to tone it down a bit. I would say let's go with something like 60. Then to keep a bit of color contrast, I'm going to use the midtones and I'm going to apply a cold hue and bring up the saturation, which will introduce a very nice looking color contrast between the colds of the foreground and the warm tones of the sky. Alright, finally let's go into the calibration tab and I'm going to bring down the blue primary hue just a little bit. That's just something I do for all my images. And let's bring up the saturation some more. Okay, and that's it for the color grading. The only thing left to do, of course, the sharpening in the details panel. Let's do that. Bring down the radius, increase the details, hold down the Alt key while applying some masking, and let's bring up the amount of sharpening. And we are done editing this image. So now we have these beautiful sunrise colors added using only a little bit of Lightroom. I hope this will help you with your images. If you have any questions left, as always, feel free to ask in the comments. Thank you for watching and see you all next time.